This is David here, and I'm just going to take a few quick minutes to show you what it looks like when we take a two-dimensional shape and we rotate it to form a three-dimensional solid. So this is right here is Unit 5, Lesson 1, and you maybe already took a look at 1.1. I just want to give you a little bit of a preview of this applet in 1.2, which can be really interesting to play with if you're interested in how these rotations work. So what you're seeing here is a two-dimensional shape, this triangle, and we're going to rotate it around an axis on this grid. So imagine that this was like attached to a pencil or a pole, and you're going to just spin that pencil or that pole really quickly, and envision what three-dimensional shape is formed as that triangle kind of whips around the flagpole or the pencil. And what you're seeing over here is the three-dimensional view. Now, we've never graphed in 3D before, but what you're seeing is an X and a Y axis like we're used to, and that triangle is kind of flat horizontally on the X and Y grid. And then what's weird here is this vertical axis is labeled Z. That's the third dimension. So if you're ever graphing in 3D, you'll have X, Y, and Z. What we can see here is if I drag this little slider, it's going to rotate my shape in 2D around an axis to form a three-dimensional solid. Now you can see there's a lot going on in this applet that's programmed to make it work nicely, but you can see right here it's going to rotate around the y-axis. So we can start to sort of envision that it's going to rotate as if this is the pole or the pencil that I've attached my triangle to as I start to spin it. And what happens as I drag this is we're going to start to see that triangle spin out, 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 and around the y-axis. Now what does that 3D shape look like? It's a little hard to see from this view. I just kind of see a circle. But if we use this button on the applet, we can sort of spin it around. And in fact, it makes a cone, right? There's a circle at the bottom and a point at the top. And if you look at this triangle and sort of try to envision this line here coming out from the y-axis, that's creating that circular base as we spin it. And this point at the top, well, it's going to stay right on the axis, so when we rotate it, it's just going to stay right there. That's creating this point at the vertex of the cone. Now this applet has some really interesting shapes. If I uncheck 1 and check 2, I can look at this shape. And we'll just take a quick tour of what these kind of look like. So as I start to rotate this, you see this start to form this very interesting three-dimensional shape. It almost looks like it's going to be a cone, but it doesn't taper to a point, which should kind of make sense because this doesn't taper to a point up here. So what we have is a circular base formed here and a larger circular base formed here. Now what's going on in the middle, if you can sort of envision it and see it here, this little open rectangle, as I rotate it, is forming a hollow little cylinder inside of my solid. Let's look at some others. Now this one here is just a square along our grid, and we're going to rotate it around this axis. So as I do that, it can be a little hard here to see what's happening, but as I spin it, hopefully you'll see it's forming a circular base from this segment coming out from the axis, and another circular base from this segment coming out from the axis. So it ends up with two congruent circular bases, and this is a cylinder. Now it doesn't have to be a square to form a cylinder. It could have been any rectangle just lining up along that axis. This fourth one is a rectangle. It's not quite touching the axis though, so you're going to see something interesting when I rotate this. It's going to look like it's going to form a cylinder, but what happens in the middle? Well, that gap between the rectangle and the axis, that's forming a little hole in the middle. So it's a hollow cylinder inside of the bigger cylinder. It kind of looks like a donut, right? Now this applet is really cool, and if you keep exploring the lesson, 1.3 will give you the option to kind of play with it some more. But what you can do is you can actually drag these points and see what happens to your shape. So if I wanted to like make this just any old rectangle, I know this doesn't look like a rectangle yet, but I'll get there. You can see that it would just form a cylinder, just like our other, the square did, right? So it doesn't have to be a square, it could just be a rectangle. We would still see that cylinder form a circular base on the top and a circular base on the bottom. And then when I bring these into a point to form kind of like a triangle, that's when you're going to see that cone. There's a couple other common shapes we'll talk about. If you rotate a semicircle, which is hard for me to make on this grid, If you can kind of envision half of a circle along the axis and then us rotating it around, it would form a sphere. Those are probably the most common ones that we'll explore, but you might see a few more as we go through our lessons and our discussions. So thanks for joining me.